Atlantic wall has been penetrated. There, after the first assault, the Allies clung precariously to a few beaches. But now they have a solid foothold on Fortress Europa. Men and material have poured onto the newly won beachheads with every favorable tide, and on some unfavorable ones. The Allied command has announced that the Battle of the Beaches is complete. The tremendous offensive was bitterly contested. The Nazis knew that each passing hour diminished their chances of throwing the Allies back into the sea. But the American, British, and Canadian troops pressed forward firmly onto the soil of France.
The D-Day invasion of France at the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was the culmination of around a year's worth of planning by Allied military strategists, intelligence operatives, logistics experts, engineers, meteorologists, and many others. Once the 5 beachheads were established, there would begin the long push into Nazi-occupied France and the drive towards the heart of Germany itself. As meticulous as the plans had been, those who made them knew things could and would go wrong, and they could only do so much against the inevitable loss of life and material that would come from fighting such an entrenched enemy. What they failed to anticipate, however, was that their momentum would be slowed not by that enemy or even overstretched supply lines, but by dirt and plants. These were not just any dirt and plants, though, but ancient hedgerows, called boucage in French. They traced their existence to farmers as early as the medieval periods of Europe, who needed fencing to delineate property bounds, corral livestock, and act as windbreaks to protect their crops against erosion. In regions like Normandy that lacked convenient sources of rock or timber, they improvised with long earthen mounds around their plots of land, often with drainage ditches and sunken lanes running along their bases. These mounds could be anywhere from 3 to 12 feet tall and some 1 to 4 feet thick. In time, these were built out further by the thick stands of shrubs, trees, and other plants that grew on them, their roots anchoring the soil and forming dense, tangled barriers, sometimes called living fences, as much as 15 feet high. The fields they encircled were often irregularly shaped, typically only around 400 yards long and 200 yards wide, giving the Normandy countryside a crazy quilt appearance from above. What had worked well enough for centuries of agriculture, however, made the terrain a nightmare as a battlefield, especially for invading forces. Between June 7th and 12th, the U.S. Army's 26th Infantry Regiment managed to penetrate some 20 miles from their landing at Omaha Beach, only to be stopped cold in a 30-day stalemate by the maze of narrow lanes and tiny fields that gave the advantage to the defending Germans. American GIs had received no training how to fight in such a place and had to adapt the best they could, learning to listen for telltale sounds that might give away the position of an unseen enemy. Both sides relied on reconnaissance patrols to locate targets for mortar fire attacks. The Germans made good use of their hedgerow fortress to conceal wires to facilitate communication, as well as hiding machine gun emplacements, snipers' nests, and explosive booby traps. Allied troops were forced to dig in the same. Their previous rapid advances of miles bogged down into costly battles of attrition, field by field, where gains were measured in yards. But if the landscape was hell for the American infantry on foot, certainly mechanized units should be able to use the brute strength of their tanks just to smash through, right? Well, not exactly. These ancient mounds of compacted soil, armored with thick tangles of thorny greenery, were not so easily moved. The engines of the Sherman tanks brought into the fight strained hard against them. Often the best they could do was climb slowly over the mounds, often after several tries, but this exposed their poorly armored underbellies. German troops learned to wait for a tank to become hiked upwards as it struggled over before firing their Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons into the weak spot. American sappers used explosives and bulldozers to clear holes, but this was a slow process that alerted the enemy they were coming. The success of the liberation of Europe was in a very real danger of being stalled by the fences of medieval farmers. They needed something that would allow tanks to break through as rapidly as possible, but without exposing their undersides, and all while maintaining whatever element of surprise they still had. But what? This is where the New Jersey History Connection comes in. The pleasant community of Cranford, New Jersey, growing along the Raritan Valley Line railroad tracks, is a long way from the hedgerows of Normandy. Yet, like many places, sitting in its memorial park stands a monument to those residents who lost their lives in service from World War I through Vietnam, 86 in all. But the Second World War alone accounts for 57 of the total names. But among those lucky enough to survive had been Curtis Grubb Cullen III. Born in Cranford, February 10, 1915, he was named after Curtis Grubb, an ancestor who was an early and ardent supporter of American independence. He ran a family ironworks that supplied the Patriots with cannons, ammunition, and other items before serving as a colonel in the militia. Curtis Grubb Cullen was the third of his family to carry the name. There was little about his background that would predict the role he would play at Normandy. The census from 1940 shows he was living with his parents at 215 Holly Street. Curtis Sr. and his son worked for Schenley Industries, a liquor distributor headquartered in the Empire State Building in Manhattan. The 24-year-old Curtis Jr. was listed as a display man who evidently worked in sales. When he enlisted in the Army on January 6, 1941, he was recorded as having completed 4 years of high school, standing 5 foot 5 inches tall, and weighing 135 pounds. He was made a tanker with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the New Jersey National Guard's Essex Troop, 2nd Armored Division. He learned how to drive, shoot, and maintain tanks, the very sort of men who were at risk thanks to those hedgerows at Normandy, where Cullen found himself during the invasion. One day, a group of men from the 102nd were discussing their predicament. A man named Roberts, who hailed from the backwoods of Tennessee, suggested they put teeth on the front of their tanks like a big saw. Most just laughed at what they considered a hillbilly silly remark. Not Sergeant Cullen. He recognized there was a germ of a good idea in there. It just needed some work. So he organized the creation of a prototype, welded to the front of a tank, and made from the scrap metal salvaged from defensive check traps called check hedgehogs. They were shaped to form large tusks, protruding out the lower front of the tank chassis. The initial experiments worked well enough that on July 14, 1944, a demonstration was made for Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, who watched in awe as the tank, dubbed the Rhino, smashed quickly through the hedgerows. He ordered similar attachments be made using the thousands of hedgehogs littering the beach as part of the Germans' failed Atlantic defenses. Crews worked day and night, welding them together in a large tent. In all, some 500 Cullen Rhino devices were made and welded into nearly 3/4 of the 102nd's tanks, and the British also adopted them. They enabled the Allies to break out of hedgerow country and finally achieve the objective they started out with, of capturing the city of St. Lo. Cullen always tried to give the Tennessean Roberts credit for the original idea, but he was swept aside by the press, and Cullen became something of an American hero who saved the Normandy invasion, receiving the Legion of Merit Award. 4 months later, however, Cullen lost part of his left leg to a landmine that also damaged his hearing in Germany's Hürtgen Forest. He received a Purple Heart and returned home to his job as a salesman for Schenley Industries. In 1945, he married Bernice Enright and moved to Greenwich Village in New York. The story of the Cullen Rhino was used to boost morale, being framed as an example of American ingenuity in a crisis. When he died November 20th, 1963 at just 48 years old, his life was summarized primarily as the hero of the hedgerows. When President Dwight D. Eisenhower was interviewed by CBS's Walter Cronkite in honor of the 20th anniversary of the D-Day invasion he had overseen as a general, he remembered,
"And finally a little sergeant in an ordnance department, his name was Cullen, and he had an idea. All it was in the world was to took a tank and with welding a bar on there, they welded then little plows, you might call them, snouts. Actually, we found the steel for it down on the beaches where the Germans had made these beach obstacles down there. We took that steel, welded little plows, you might call them. They just cut off this bank as you went into it, and this kept your tank right square level, guns blazing when the next hedgerow, which was only 50 yards away. And on top of that, you really carried some of your own camouflage with you as you went through the thing. This idea very quickly got into the very top echelons, to General Bradley, to be specific. He took a look at this man's homemade model, and he just went ecstatic, proving that the Army brass is not always just Colonel Blimps.
World history can sometimes turn on a single individual. As fate had it, the Normandy invasion was unstuck thanks to a liquor distribution salesman and a New Jersey history connection.